that's designed to pump body to two places. It's designed to pump body to your lungs for gas exchange, and then it's designed to pump blood to all of the cells of your body for gas exchange. So that's the general purpose of the heart. So in order for blood to get to the level of your cells, we have to have blood vessels. So blood vessels are kind of like a key component that we also need to talk about. And blood is the conduit by which oxygen gets exchanged, nutrients get delivered, and waste like carbon dioxide get freed from your body. So we'll talk about blood. The respiratory system is a separate organ system purely designed to bring oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about the respiratory system as a separate organ system shortly. But we'll start with the heart for now, okay? As far as the heart goes, okay, when you guys are looking at your book and any other reference book in regards to blood vessels and blood flow, the kind of blood that flows through blood vessels, when you typically see a blue color, okay, so a blue color designating a specific vessel means that that particular vessel is carrying oxygen poor blood, okay? So if we're talking about blood that's oxygen poor, then it's more than likely going to be carbon dioxide rich, okay? Because that's the exchange. If we're bringing in CO2, we're probably offloading, sorry, if we're bringing in O2, we're probably offloading CO2, okay? So blue is gonna designate oxygen poor. So then conversely, if you see red vessels designates oxygen rich, okay? Or CO2 poor, okay? So, and that's pretty much a gold standard for all reference materials in terms of the cardiovascular system, okay? So when you see red versus blue, that's what they're designating. If there's a purple kind of thrown in, that usually means there's some sort of exchange happening. And exchange usually happens at the level of the smallest blood vessels that we have in our body called capillaries, or capillary beds we call them. We'll talk much more about those later, okay? Okay. So, the heart itself, like I said, is this miraculous pump that's designed to pump blood to two locations in the body, to your lungs and to the rest of your body, okay? So, because of that, we have two circuits that the heart is involved in. The first one is called the pulmonary circuit, and the pulmonary circuit tells you where blood is going to, because pulmonary refers to what organ? Lungs, okay? So the pulmonary circuit, in a nutshell, we can say it's taking blood from the heart to your lungs and then back to your heart. Okay, so that's the pulmonary circuit in a nutshell, okay? The systemic circuit, on the other hand, is taking blood from your heart and pumping it to your entire body, okay? So the systemic circuit starts at the heart, goes out to your body, and then comes back to the heart, okay? And this includes the heart itself as an organ and lungs and stuff like that. And we'll talk more about those organs as well and how they get their own blood supply. Okay, so how does blood get to the body and how does blood get to the lungs? Well, we need blood vessels, okay? And blood vessels are defined by where they're carrying blood, okay? Or whether or not exchange is occurring within them, okay? So when blood leaves the heart, okay, it enters a blood vessel called an artery, okay? So arteries always by definition carry blood away from the heart. Just think away, okay? Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. It doesn't matter if that blood is oxygen rich or oxygen poor. Don't just assume that arteries carry oxygen-rich blood, because it's not true, and we'll find out, okay? By definition, arteries always carry blood away from the heart, okay? So, they're carrying blood away from the heart to two locations, either to your lungs or to your body, okay? And when they get there, they're going to meet another set of blood vessels called capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels in your body. So in this diagram, the purple region, so this represents your body, so systemic circuit. The lungs represent your pulmonary circuit. Okay, so purple in the lungs, purple in the body. That's where arteries carrying oxygen-rich blood, carrying blood away from the heart are going to meet up. They're going to meet up with capillaries, okay? So these two big blue ones leaving the heart, they're meeting up with capillaries. So arteries are always going to meet up with capillaries, okay? Capillaries is where exchange happens. So it's where O2 leaves, CO2 enters, okay? Or vice versa. Capillaries are the smallest, thinnest blood vessels in the body, so they're perfect for exchange, okay? Across the endothelium membrane, simple diffusion, okay? Going down the concentration gradient. We'll repeat some of these concepts you guys already know again, and it'll start to make sense, okay? So from capillaries then, capillaries join up with what are called veins, okay? And veins always, by definition, carry blood back to the heart, okay? Doesn't matter if that oxygen, the blood is oxygen rich or oxygen poor, veins are going to carry blood back to the heart. So back to the heart here, these are blue, back to the heart here, these are red. It doesn't matter, they are both considered veins because they're carrying blood back to the heart. Okay, so that's the general direction that blood is going to go. It's going to leave the heart, it's going to enter an artery, it's going to enter a capillary, then it's going to follow into a vein, and then it's going to go back to the heart. And that system just kind of repeats itself over and over and over again. Okay? Okay. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about just basic location of the heart. The heart has two parts, okay? It has a base and an apex. We'll identify these in lab. Apex, again, kind of like the apex of your patella, comes to a point. So it comes to a point inferiorly on the organ, okay? And the base is at the top. The base is like a big flat portion at the top of the heart where the great vessels exit. So that's considered the base, okay? All right, and the heart is not perfectly in the center of the mediastinum. It kind of tilts a little bit to the left and a little bit forward anteriorly, okay? But we already know that the heart lives in the pericardial cavity, which is located within the mediastinum, okay? And above the pericardial cavity is where we find these great vessels, and we will identify those shortly, okay? Okay. Now, let me just go back to the previous one really quick. So the heart is surrounded by a fibrous capsule, okay? And then we also know that the heart is surrounded by a serous membrane. What do we call the serous membrane of the heart? Pericardium. Okay. So the pericardium is going to lay deep to the fibrous capsule. The fibrous capsule is going to stabilize the heart against the great vessels and inferiorly against the diaphragm muscle. Okay? So that's the fibrous capsule. So deep to that is going to be your serous membrane. Okay? All right, so this picture, superficially, we're taking a little chunk here, okay? Here's the pericardium, which is that serous membrane. We're talking superficial to that. So superficial to that, okay, we have what's called the fibrous layer, okay? Now, the fibrous layer, or the fibrous capsule, okay, connects to the outer layer of pericardium called the parietal layer of pericardium, okay? So fibrous capsule attaches to parietal layer of the pericardium, okay? Then deep to that, laying directly on top of the heart as an organ, is the visceral pericardium, okay? And then in between the parietal and visceral layer, we have a what? What do we have? A cavity, right? And in that cavity is what?
Serous fluid.
It's fluid, right? And what's the fluid designed to do? Reduce friction, right? Because the heart is really kind of just nestled within that pericardial cavity. We want to give it a little flexibility, a little room to move. Okay, so we got serous fluid in here. We can call it pericardial fluid. That's fine. Now, one thing to note is the deepest layer, the visceral layer of pericardium, okay, which is the outer wall of the heart, is also called the epicardium. So the visceral pericardium, you can also call the epicardium, which is the outermost layer of the heart wall, okay? Okay. Now, the bottom here, I put fibrous skeleton. So this outer fibrous connective tissue is gonna be responsible for anchoring the heart, providing it structural support, and then also insulating the electricity that's being generated within it, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so that's what that fibrous outer capsule is for. Okay, so now we know that the visceral layer of pericardium is also called the epicardium, which is the most superficial layer of the heart wall, okay? So now the box changes. So the heart wall has 3 layers. It has an outer epicardium, which is also called visceral pericardium. The thickest layer is called the myocardium. What kind of tissue do we think that is?
Cardiac.
Muscle tissue, specifically cardiac, yeah, because we're talking about the heart. And then the deepest layer is going to be the endocardium. And the endocardium layer is what makes up the valves of the heart. So the valves that we're going to talk about shortly, those are made of endocardium. Okay, so those 3 layers make up the wall of the heart itself. Okay. So now, this is such a nice picture. So this is a frontal slice through the heart. It's unlabeled, okay? So when you guys are practicing your heart structures and you're going through the circuits of the heart and everything that we're gonna draw in a moment, you should be able to label this picture 100% without looking at your notes. All the vessels, all the chambers, all the layers, all the valves, all the structures that are associated with this picture, you should be able to label, okay? But for now, let's introduce, okay, what we have in the heart, which are 4 chambers, okay? We have 2 superiorly located, what are called atria. Atria is plural. Atrium, I-U-M, is singular. So we have a right atrium and we have a left atrium, okay? Now remember, when you're looking at the heart in a textbook, on a model, on a specimen, okay, the right side of the heart is that specimen's right side, not your right, okay? So the right side is here, the left side is here. So you have to get used to that, okay? Okay, so the atria chambers, one on the right, one on the left, are considered the receiving chambers of the heart. So they are going to receive blood. Okay, so they're the receiving chambers. Okay, inferior to that, we have the right and the left ventricle. Okay? Ventricles are considered the pumps. They are the pumping chambers. They are going to pump blood out of the heart to either one of 2 locations, the lungs or the rest of your body. If the ventricle is pumping to the lungs, what circuit would you say it's part of?
Pulmonary.
The pulmonary circuit, right? If the ventricle is pumping to your entire body, it's part of the systemic circuit. Okay, good. Okay, I think, all right. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna draw. Because it's much more fun than me jabbering over a bunch of slides. So, okay. And you're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4 areas in this box, all right? So on the right, so on the specimen's right side, okay, or on the left side of your box, I made a chamber that's more like a square in blue, okay? And on the right side of my box, or on the specimen's left side, I made a chamber like a square which is bordered in red, okay? Again, if you don't have red and blue, it's okay, just be consistent with your colors so you know. Below them, okay, more rectangular, all right, same thing, red on the right, blue on the left in terms of boundary. Now, straight down the middle, I drew a big wall. And color's irrelevant, I just chose gray, okay? And we'll label that wall in a minute. Okay. I left an opening here in between both sides of my box, okay? So we can add a structure. And then on this particular side, okay, where it's blue, I've left 1, 2, 3 openings, okay? So that's representing our heart, just rudimentary, okay? My little yellow brackets on the side, you can use whatever you want. You can make them clouds, you can make whatever color you want. Those are representing the lungs, okay? So that's just my representation of the lungs. Okay, don't worry about any of the abbreviations yet. We'll get there as we go along and we start adding to this picture. Okay, so just make sure everybody's ready here. Different color. Make sure everyone has the basic skeleton down here. So on my wall here, I have 2 labels, okay? On the top here, in between the 2 atria chambers, I have IAS, and that stands for interatrial septum. Okay, so IAS, interatrial septum. Septum means wall in Latin. Okay, so it's a wall in between the 2 atria chambers. Okay. Down here, in between the 2 ventricle chambers, I have IVS. IVS stands for the interventricular septum. Okay, so that's interventricular septum. Now these walls are important because they keep the blood on either side of the heart separate. You do not want blood mixing from side to side, okay? So if you notice, the right side of the heart, again, specimen's right side, is delineated in blue. Blue stands for what kind of blood? Oxygen poor. So more likely than not, this kind of blood, if it's oxygen poor, where's that blood wanting to go? Lungs. To the lungs, right, for gas exchange, okay. So on the left side, red represents oxygen rich. So the right side, the left side of the heart is going to be pumping to where? To the entire body, right? It's going to feed your cells. Your mitochondria need oxygen 24/7, 365 the entire time you're on the planet, right? Okay. Very much in demand. Okay, so let's just label the chambers here so we know what it is we're looking at. All right, so for the top square, I'm just going to put right atrium, RA. For the bottom square, right ventricle, and then left, hold on, I'm going to change color here so I'm going to stay consistent with the color. Okay, so left atrium, left ventricle. Right ventricle, let's do that. Okay. Right ventricle. Okay, so let's start by labeling some of the blood vessels that come from the body and enter the heart. So we'll start with vessels that bring blood to the heart, okay? So bringing blood to the heart, we're coming from 3 different directions, and that's why on this right atrium, I drew 3 different scenarios, okay? So one's coming from above, one's coming from below, and one kind of makes a U-turn right in the middle. Okay. Okay. The one coming from above, I'm labeling S, V, C. And that stands for, on the right-hand side here, superior vena cava. Cava. C-A-V-A. Okay? So the superior vena cava is taking blood from everywhere above the diaphragm. All of the blood above the diaphragm that needs to come back to the heart for gas exchange, that's going to enter the right atrium of the heart through the superior vena cava. Okay? Okay. So, coming from below the diaphragm, we have IVC, and IVC is the inferior vena cava. So that's taking all the blood from below the diaphragm that needs to go back to the lungs for gas exchange and bringing it back to the heart. So if I had to draw arrows as far as flow goes, the flow is heading back towards the right atrium. Okay, flow is heading up towards right atrium, or down towards right atrium. Okay, the circle, kind of the U-turn, I'm labeling CS, which stands for coronary sinus. And what that is that's a smaller blood vessel that's draining blood from the heart itself as an organ. Okay, so the heart's an organ, which means it needs its own blood supply. We'll talk more about that. But deoxygenated blood that needs gas exchange that's coming from the heart as an organ is going to enter a smaller vessel called the coronary sinus, and it's going to dump right into the right atrium. Okay, so the right atrium has 3 openings where it's receiving blood from above the diaphragm, below the diaphragm, and the heart itself as an organ. Okay. Okay. All right. So blood is then going to enter the right atrium. It's going to go through a structure, and we'll get back to those. It's going to enter a structure, and that's going to allow it to pass into the right ventricle. Okay. So the right ventricle, we know it's a ventricle, so it is a pumping chamber. Okay. So the right ventricle is going to pump blood. Because the right ventricle is blue in color, it's going to pump blood where? To the lungs. Okay. So I'm just going to take kind of like a blue start in the upper corner of the right ventricle, and I'm going to make it branch on both sides. Okay. All right. Now, the main branch that I first drew is PT. PT stands for the pulmonary trunk. Okay. Now, when you hear a blood vessel that uses the word trunk, think of a tree trunk. It's going to branch into further branches. And it does. Okay. So blood flow through this is coming from the right ventricle, and it's heading up. Okay. And then it splits. And it's going to head to the left, and it's going to head to the right. And we're going to call these PA. So I'm going to label left, and I'm labeling right. PA stands for pulmonary arteries. Why arteries? What's the definition of an artery?
Away from the heart.
It's carrying blood away from the heart, okay? And because it's got pulmonary in the name, it's telling you where that blood is going, which is where? To the lungs, okay? All right, so that blood is heading to the lungs, okay? Now, let me just label my lungs here. So I've got right lung, I've got left lung. Okay. I'm just going to use purple for capillaries. It doesn't matter, Okay, so that blood, let me just draw a dotted line here so that you kind of have an idea where it's going. So this blood is going to come down both sides. And it's going to enter, arteries connect to a different kind of blood vessel where gas exchange happens. And what is the name of that blood vessel? Smallest blood vessel in the body? Capillaries. So I'm just gonna call them caps. Okay. And since we're talking about capillaries in the lungs, these are pulmonary capillaries. Okay. So this is where exchange is going to happen. So this is where CO2 is going to be offloaded and O2 is going to be brought on board. Because the blood that's coming into these pulmonary capillaries is going to be oxygen poor and CO2 rich. Okay, so CO2 is a waste, we've got to offload it. So we offload it when we exhale. Okay, so this is where CO2 physically leaves your bloodstream and enters your lungs as an organ, and where oxygen physically leaves your lungs and enters your bloodstream and latches onto hemoglobin and begins the journey, okay? Utilizing your blood as the highway to get to all the cells of your body for exchange, okay? Okay, so exchange has happened, okay? CO2 has been offloaded, O2 has been brought on board, so now we need to bring that blood back to the heart. And we're gonna do that two different ways. Let me show you here. Okay, so on the right side, I'm just drawing two red vessels, and I'm gonna label them PV. Okay. And on the left side, I'm just gonna do two blood vessels, and I'm gonna name those PV. Now, from the right side, those veins go behind the heart and then attach to the left atrium. So if it gets confusing, you can just do a little dotted line. If you want to tell yourself, okay, that's where it's ultimately going. That's where it's ultimately dumping its blood, all right? But I don't want to draw on top of this, it's gonna get like, whoa, so confusing. So these veins are going behind, and they're entering the left atrium. On the left side, you got them right here, boom, going right into the left atrium, okay? PV stands for pulmonary veins. And veins, by definition, carry blood where? Back to the heart. And because they're called pulmonary veins, that blood is coming from where? The lungs, okay? So again, we've labeled pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. Pulmonary arteries carry oxygen poor blood, right? Pulmonary veins carry oxygen rich blood. So don't assume that all arteries carry oxygen rich blood. That's not a true statement. I love this for true and false. Okay, keep that in mind. Okay. All right, so we've got freshly oxygenated blood entering the left atrium. Okay. It's going to pass through a structure, and it's going to enter the left ventricle. Okay, so now we're on the left side of the heart, bounded by red, so we know this is oxygen-rich blood, CO2 deficient. So now, the left ventricle is a pumping chamber. And because it's the left side of the heart and we bounded it in red, where is that blood gonna go?
Organs.
It's gonna go to the heart, it's gonna go to the body, right? To the systemic system. It's going everywhere. Okay, so from the left ventricle then, we have to draw another, okay, here's where it gets a little dicey, but we can do it. Big red vessel. And it curves to the left on purpose. Okay, curves to the left on purpose. I'm going to continue it at the bottom here, curving underneath. Now I'm gonna draw arrows where flow's going. Flow's going up, and it's going around, and it's going down, and it's going here. Okay. And this giant red one, we're calling the aorta. Okay. And we'll learn parts of the aorta later, but for now, the big red vessel that is coming off of the left ventricle, carrying blood to the entire body, is called the aorta. Now, let me change back to purple here. Because we're back in an artery, arteries lead into what kind of blood vessels? Capillaries. Since we're talking about body capillaries, these are systemic capillaries. The ones in the lungs, what did we call those? Pulmonary capillaries. Okay. So at the level of systemic capillaries, okay, which is your body, let me just highlight this and just say body. Just your entire body. Okay. This is where exchange happens. So oxygen-rich blood is going to all of your capillary beds throughout your body, and at that point is where oxygen gets offloaded and delivered to all of your cells. The mitochondria grab it and start generating ATP for cellular metabolism. Okay? But we gotta finish the flow here. So capillaries empty into what kind of vessels? What do capillaries connect to?
Veins.
Veins. So we gotta take a blue and connect it. I'm just gonna connect it to the inferior vena cava and finish off the cycle. So once exchange has occurred, then that blood ultimately gets dumped back into a vein, and we know veins by definition carry blood back to the heart. Okay. Okay. Now, another way you can think about arteries by definition is arteries, because they're carrying blood away from the heart, okay, they have a tendency to branch and diverge, okay? Because arteries are ultimately going to be the blood vessels that feed your organs and your tissues. So you want it to branch and diverge. You want to get lots of branches to feed your cells. And you can say that veins, because veins' only job is to bring blood back to the heart, they're going to merge and converge together. Okay, so we have billions of veins in the body, but ultimately flow from all of those veins is going to end up in one of three main veins that's going to dump it back into the right atrium. So veins from the diaphragm down are all going to merge and converge and ultimately deliver their product into the IVC. Veins above the diaphragm ultimately are going to merge and converge together and ultimately dump their blood into the SVC. Okay, veins on the heart itself superficially as an organ are ultimately going to merge and converge and ultimately dump their blood into the coronary sinus, which is going to dump it into the right atrium. Okay. Okay. All right. So, let's talk a little bit about valves. I'm just going to switch colors here. Okay. Valves. Valves are important in the heart because valves are designed to prevent backflow. Okay, and I'll repeat myself again, and this is on one of your slides that we're coming to. So veins prevent backflow, valves. Valves prevent backflow. Blood is designed to go in one direction and one direction only through the cardiovascular circuit. You do not want backflow. There's no time for that, okay? Also, now we can see why we have interatrial and interventricular septums, okay? Because the right side of the heart is responsible for delivering blood where?
Lungs.
To the lungs. The left side of the heart is responsible for bringing blood where? To your entire body, right? You don't want that blood to mix, because the right side's oxygen poor, the left side's oxygen rich. So that's why we have two septums, two walls that separate both sides of the heart. So you got two different circuits working at the same time with two different jobs. Okay, pretty amazing if you think about it. It's like, wow, I didn't know that when I was studying the heart. I'm like, that's pretty damn cool. Okay, so now valves prevent backflow. So the first valve, I'm going to label here, is in between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay. And I'm just going to label it TV. TV stands for the tricuspid valve. It is also called the right atrioventricular valve. Telling you exactly what two chambers it connects. Okay? So the tricuspid valve is the same thing as the right atrioventricular valve. Okay? Prevents backflow. Okay. So then on the other side, between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have BV. And BV, does anyone hazard a guess as to what that is?
Bicuspid.
The bicuspid valve, yeah. And it's basically telling you how many cusps of tissue the valve has. When we dissect the sheep heart, you'll be able to see it. Really cool. You'll be able to see tri versus bi. Okay, so bicuspid valve is also called the left atrioventricular valve, which I'm just going to abbreviate AV since I already wrote it out in my terrible writing. Okay. All right, so we have the tricuspid valve on the right, bicuspid valve on the left. How do you remember tricuspid valve on the right? I always remember try to be right. Try to be right, okay, tricuspid on the right. But you can also call it right and left, atrioventricular valve. Okay, that's fine too, same thing. Okay, so we have two more to talk about. The next kind of valve that we're going to talk about are called semilunar valves. And the first semilunar valve is located at the base of the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so it's in the right ventricle, right at the base of the pulmonary trunk. Okay. And I'm going to call that PSLV. PSLV is the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay. And the valve is named for the vessel that it's attaching to. It's attaching to the pulmonary trunk. It's the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay. At the base of the aorta, we have another semilunar valve. Okay. That is ASLV. What do you think the A stands for? Aortic. Yep. Named for the vessel that it's attaching to. Aortic semilunar valve. Okay. So these valves are responsible for preventing backflow into the ventricles. Okay. These valves are responsible for preventing backflow into the atria. Okay. Now, if we're talking circuits, okay, fair game, free response question, okay, I can ask you, List in order the structures of the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit, including all structures, valves, vessels that you pass through, organs, etc. Okay? So what are the boundaries of each of the circuits? Okay, so the pulmonary circuit, okay, pulmonary. So pulmonary circuit is designed to carry blood where? To the lungs, okay? So we're gonna start at the right ventricle for the pulmonary circuit. We're gonna start at the right ventricle, okay? Blood enters or goes through what structure? Next.
Pulmonary, semilunar.
It goes through the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is gonna put it into what vessel? The pulmonary trunk. It's then gonna branch into the left and right what? Pulmonary arteries, that's gonna carry it where? To the lungs, specifically to the level of what? Pulmonary capillaries, where exchange occurs. After exchange occurs, blood enters what? Right and left, pulmonary veins, and that brings blood where? Into the left atrium. That's the end of the pulmonary circuit. So we've gone from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart. So right ventricle to left atrium, that's pulmonary circuit. And all the structures that are involved. Okay. Okay, so let's talk systemic circuit. So systemic circuit, we're gonna start in the left ventricle. Just to make sure. Okay, so we're starting in the left ventricle. Blood goes where next? Goes through what structure? The aortic semilunar valve, and that takes the blood into the aorta, which brings blood where? To the body, okay, body, at the level of the systemic capillaries where exchange occurs, okay? After exchange occurs, blood gets dumped into IVC, or you can say SVC, okay? Either or, if we're talking above the diaphragm or below the diaphragm, okay? And then that brings blood back into what chamber? The right atrium. That's the end of the systemic circuit. So you've gone from the heart to the body and then back to the heart. Okay? So this is why it's nice to draw this, because you can practice drawing this. And it helps you with flow, it helps you with what vessels you're talking about, what valves we're talking about, okay? Where does blood go? Where are the circuits? What's involved in the circuits anatomically? What's the purpose of having two circuits? Okay? Questions about anything that we've drawn? We just have one more thing to add on it, but we're gonna do that later. And it's a couple branches off the aorta, but we'll get there. We've designed a colorful masterpiece. So, in going back to the PowerPoint here, as far as sulci and vessels go, we're really gonna study more of the vessels that cover the surface of the heart as an organ in lab. So we're actually gonna identify those on models, okay? So a sulcus, sulci is plural, a sulcus is a depression, okay? So it's like a divot, kind of like a fossa in the bone, right? So it's a divot in the heart, and usually in that depression is a blood vessel, okay? So the coronary sulcus is gonna be on the back side, and it's gonna house a blood vessel that we drew in our diagram called the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus is designed to collect blood from the heart itself as an organ and dump it into the right atrium, okay? Interventricular sulci, again, are telling you exactly where they're located on the heart, in between the ventricles, and there are blood vessels, okay, that are located within them, okay? So anterior view of the heart here, okay? We have two main arteries that feed the heart, the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery, okay? And we'll identify these in the lab. We also have what's called the circumflex artery, which it goes around the back, so that's why it's called circumflex. It'll make sense when you identify it on the model. But we have an anterior interventricular artery here in the front that lives in an anterior interventricular sulcus. Okay, so a sulcus is a depression, and in the depression lives a blood vessel. Again, it'll make more sense in lab when you actually identify the structures on the heart model, okay? Just giving you the difference here between a sulcus and an actual blood vessel. Here I just circled what we drew, interventricular septum, okay? In between the ventricles. Now I can tell you the interatrial septum you usually don't see on drawings because the big vessels are in the way. So you have to take those out, and then in between these atria, you will see a wall, okay? But usually in pictures you don't, but it does exist, okay? Okay. And again, in lab, back side of the heart, here's that big coronary sinus vein, okay, that's living in a coronary sulcus, which is a depression. And posteriorly, we also have a posterior interventricular artery in between the ventricles. And it lives in a depression called the posterior interventricular sulcus. Again, we'll get to those in lab. So for right now, it's not imperative that you know this. Okay, as far as characteristics of atria go, most of this we're going to cover in lab. On top of each of the atria, there are what are called auricles. So we have a left auricle and a right auricle, and if I go back, this one. These little flaps here are auricles, and the opening, the chambers that are underneath them are the atria. Okay, so the auricle is like a little flap-like, hand-like tissue structure that sits on top of the atria chambers, and it's basically designed to give a little bit more volume, a little bit more stretch, if needed, for the chambers, because those chambers are receiving blood. Okay, so that's what those auricles are designed for. Okay. The atria chambers are lined with muscle, cardiac muscle tissue that's called pectinate muscle. We'll identify that in lab. Crista terminalis, don't worry about that. It's just a boundary in the atria. I'm not going to ask you about that. Fossa ovalis we'll identify in lab, and I'll talk more about it in fetal circulation when it comes into play. We've identified the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves, and we've identified the 3 openings that go into and feed the right atrium. Okay. So again, as like a fact check for yourself, what vessels lead into each atria, and describe the blood these vessels are carrying. Is it oxygen rich? Is it CO2 poor? Is it oxygen poor? Is it CO2 rich? Okay, so you can kind of check your knowledge check for those questions. Okay, if we're talking about characteristics of the ventricles, ventricles have, again, involutions kind of in the walls, which you guys will identify when we do the sheep heart, called trabeculae carni. So you've got pectinate muscle in the atria, and you've got trabeculae carni in the ventricles. Okay, so that's just the only difference. Papillary muscles, again, are muscle tissue that's going to attach to these little cords that are called chordae tendineae. Gotta watch the spelling in lab. And the cords attach to the valves. Okay, so when the papillary muscles contract, they're gonna pull on the strings, which are gonna affect the valves. Okay, most likely holding them shut. Okay, but I really like this picture here. If you take just like a transverse section through the heart, and you're looking at the 2 different ventricle chambers, what do you see the difference? What's the notable difference in that picture?
The walls.
Thickness.
Okay. What layer of the wall?
The cardiac.
The myocardium. So which chamber has a thicker layer of myocardium? The left ventricle. Why?
That's the rest of the body.
Because the left ventricle pumps to your entire body, right? The right ventricle only pumps where? To your lungs. And where are your lungs in relation to your heart? Right next door, right lateral, right? So with structure comes function. There you go. okay? You'll really be able to appreciate that on the sheep heart dissection. You cut through the right side, it's like super thin. The left side, you're always like, when am I doing this right? I'm not sure. It's thick. Get in there. It's thick. Open it up, you're just like, damn, you're not kidding. Like, yeah, it's super thick. It's like 4 or 5 times the thickness. Okay. All right, here's that beautiful picture again, but it's fully labeled for you guys, so you can, again, utilize this for your reviews. Now you can be able to talk yourself through the circuits, identify all the structures, okay, talk about blood flow. This is a superior view showing the valves, the semilunar valves here, aortic and pulmonary, the tricuspid and bicuspid, 1, 2, 3 cusps of tissue, this only has 2. I forgot to mention, the bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve. So you can call the bicuspid valve the left atrioventricular valve, or you can call it the bicuspid valve, or you can call it the mitral valve. Okay. All 3 of those options are correct. And we'll repeat that again. Okay, so that's like the general anatomy of the heart and just basic structures. So now we need to talk a little bit about the mechanics of the heart and how it pumps blood through it, essentially. Okay, so when blood enters the atria, okay, we're talking right side and left side, okay, because again, the atria are the receiving chambers of the heart, okay. The atria are relaxed. And the valves are open. Okay, the valves are relaxed, the valves are open. So blood is going to go into the atria, okay? But some of that blood, just by nature of gravity, is going to trickle into the ventricle. Okay, just some. Not too much, but enough, some, okay? So those atria are going to fill. They're going to fill, okay? And once they get to their max capacity, they're going to contract, okay? Both sides, left and right. And when they contract, they are going to push blood inferiorly into their respective ventricles, okay? Now, when the atria are contracting, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves are wide open to allow blood to go from the atria into the ventricles, okay? So then the ventricles start filling with blood, okay? Now, another thing I should mention about valves is that, okay, number 1, they prevent what? Backflow. So you can think of valves as like a one-way door, okay? One-way door, it's locked. So kind of like this door. If the lock block is off, you can go out one way, but if you turn around and try to come back in, not gonna happen. Okay, so think of valves as one-way doors. Okay, so as the ventricles start filling with blood, they reach max capacity, okay? And that triggers the AV valves, left and right, to shut. Okay? So AV valves are going to shut. And then once the ventricles contract, okay, the semilunar valves are going to open. Okay? Because blood is going to want to go from the ventricles into the great vessels. Okay? So from the right ventricle, blood is going to enter the pulmonary trunk, and from the left ventricle, blood is going to enter the aorta. So both semilunar valves are wide open when the ventricles contract. However, the AV valves are shut. Okay? Because we don't want blood to go back where? When the ventricles contract, we don't want blood to go where? We don't want it to go back into the atria. So one-way doors, they shut. Secondary to the pressure buildup in the ventricles, boom, automatically shuts off the AV valves. Okay? Triggers the semilunar valves, boom, open. Okay, so blood goes into their respective vessels. And then after ventricular contraction and the ventricles relax, because the ventricles are pumping blood superiorly, because that's where the great vessels live, they live up above, blood is gonna wanna, by gravity, trickle back down, okay? But the semilunar valves are one-way doors. And once blood goes through them and the ventricles relax, if blood tries to trickle back, bam, the one-way door shuts. And it does not let that happen. Okay. Okay. Now, the shutting of both the AV valves and the semilunar valves is so sharp, it's so loud, that you can hear it with a stethoscope. Okay? And it's a sequential event of 2 steps. Okay? And we call that lub and dub. Okay? I don't want you to memorize where all the little pads are, that doesn't matter. Okay? What I want you to know is that the lub, the first beat that you hear, is the AV valve shutting. Okay, the AV valve slamming shut. Okay, the second, the dub sound, is the semilunar valve shutting. And the sound that you're hearing is blood hitting those valves, blood trying to go backwards, slamming into the valves, and the valves are one-way doors, and they say no. Bam, you're hitting a block wall, generating 2 sounds, a lub and a dub. So a heartbeat, when we listen to a heartbeat, it's bump bump. It's a sequential 2-step event. Okay, atrial contraction followed by ventricular contraction. Okay, so at rest, on average, you know, people's average resting heartbeat is around 70 beats a minute. You know, that's pretty good frequency for lub dub. Okay. So the terms systole and diastole refer to whether we're talking about contraction or whether we're talking about relaxation or expansion. Okay, so systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. Okay. Okay. So when the atria fill with blood, okay, what do they have to be in order to accept that blood? Are they in systole or diastole?
Diastole.
They have to be in diastole, right? They have to be relaxed in order to receive the blood. Okay. So while the atria are filling with blood, okay, simultaneously, the ventricles are doing what? The ventricles, they get a little bit, okay, but that's like, it's like a minuscule hypersecond that they receive that kind of blood. Because at the same time, you've got the ventricles going through systole, okay? So as the atria are accepting and receiving blood, okay, the ventricles are pumping what they have out into the great vessels. Because you cannot have all 4 chambers in systole. Because if all 4 chambers are in systole, blood doesn't go anywhere. So you have to have alternating patterns of relaxation and contraction in order to move blood through the machine. Okay? So while the ventricles are contracting and going through systole, the atria are relaxing and receiving blood for the next cycle. Okay? Once the ventricles finish systole, okay, they relax. They go into diastole, and because they're relaxing, what happens to the atria? The atria contract because they are full of blood and they're ready to move. So boom, then you get atrial systole. And it pumps blood into relaxed ventricles that are ready to receive it. Okay? Okay. So it's all about pressure and it's all about volume. So a heartbeat is first atrial contraction followed by ventricular contraction, but not all 4 chambers contracting at the same time. Okay, because if chambers are contracting, other chambers have to be relaxing, right? Otherwise blood is not going to move through the machine. Okay. All right. Okay, so the rest of these are basically just talking about exactly what we just went through. Both circuits, okay, so you can utilize all the rest of these as like summary slides. If you want to take yourself step by step, it colors each chamber and tells you the different circuits. So you can utilize that for your review. I chose to do a beautiful drawing instead. Okay. So as far as muscle of the heart is concerned, cardiac muscle tissue, which we are going to look at or have looked at under the microscope, depending on where you're at, cardiac muscle tissue kind of looks like bamboo. They look like pieces of bamboo because they've got these structures called intercalated discs, and intercalated discs help propagate electricity through the muscle, okay? So cardiac muscle tissue has desmosomes, which we've talked about way in the beginning, okay? Cell junctions, and then also gap junctions. Again, gap junctions are like the holes in between the cells to allow cells to communicate. Well, the gap junctions in cardiac muscle tissue allow for electricity to pass from cell to cell, okay? Which is important for contraction. That's what we need. Okay, so we've talked about the basic anatomy of the heart and blood flow. We've talked about the mechanics of how the heart pumps blood through it. So now the third part is we need to talk about the electricity that generates the movement, that generates the contraction, right? Because again, muscles can't contract without an action potential, right? Without some sort of an electrical impulse. So the heart, okay, in and of itself, we call it myogenic, which means it has its own electrical system. It has its own electrical system, okay? So we've got special nervous cells in the heart that are designed to generate electrical impulses within the heart itself as an organ, okay? So regardless of whether the nervous system is alive or not, if you severed your nervous system, okay, but your myogenic system of the heart is still functioning and it hasn't been injured, your heart's still going to beat. You don't have to have a nervous system in order for your heart to beat because your heart has its own electrical system. Okay? Now the nervous system can influence the heart. We'll talk about that in a minute. It can influence it, but it's not necessary for the heart to beat. Okay? Okay, so I've listed in order here the way electricity moves through the heart, through these specialized structures, okay? So, the first player is called the sinoatrial node, okay, which is called the pacemaker. And it's found in the upper kind of ceiling of the right atrium. And this is the pacemaker because this is what generates the action potential. So for every action potential the sinoatrial node makes, you get a heartbeat. So for every impulse, generate a heartbeat, generate a love dub. Okay. So once the pacemaker fires off an action potential, okay, it's going to spread through both atria. So it's got communication to both atria. It's going to enter what's called an internodal pathway, which then is going to hit another specialized group of cells called the atrioventricular node. And that's because it's closer to the ventricle, okay, atrioventricular node, okay? And then typically there's going to be a slight pause, okay? There's going to be a slight pause. And then after that, the electrical signal is going to enter what's called the atrioventricular bundle, or the bundle of His, okay? Then we're in the interventricular septum here now, okay? So the bundle of His is in the interventricular septum. It splits into a left and a right, what's called bundle branch. And that left bundle branch and the right bundle branch wraps underneath each ventricle, okay? And turns into what are called Purkinje fibers. And those Purkinje fibers will penetrate the myocardium level of the heart, layer of the heart, and it will penetrate the papillary muscle that I talked about that's going to attach to those strings that attach ultimately to the valves. Okay? So there's a reason why this pathway goes down and then wraps itself around the bottom of each ventricle and comes back up again. Because as the electricity comes down and around, it's going to force the ventricles to pump upward, right? Because the ventricles have to pump against gravity, essentially, to get blood into the great vessels. Well, they do that based on the pattern of the electrical impulses that's coming through the myocardium, hitting the papillary muscles, contracting them, pulling on the chordae tendineae, closing the valves, ultimately allowing you to hear the love dub, okay? So the break here at the AV node, okay, is responsible for allowing the atrioventricular, so to allow the left and the right atria to contract and push blood into the ventricles before the ventricles contract. So you have to have a slight pause, right? You can't have them all contracting at once. So once you hit the AV node, there's a slight pause in order to allow ventricles to fill. Slight pause, and then boom, ventricular contraction occurs. Okay? So the next slide is basically just telling you that, yes, there is influence via the nervous system to the heart, but the nervous system can only affect the heart rate by making it beat faster or slower, and the force of contraction. Okay? It can't affect the fact that the heart has electricity. Okay? It can affect the rate, and it can affect the force, okay, of contraction. So don't memorize this picture. We haven't even talked about nervous system yet. We'll get there. But the nervous system is split into two different divisions, which I've highlighted in red, okay? Parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. And they're responsible for different things, different situations, okay? So parasympathetic is responsible for resting and digesting, okay? So if we talk about parasympathetic nervous system, we'll repeat this again. This is when you're resting and digesting. So right now, your parasympathetic nervous system is in control. So when you're resting and digesting, it's going to slow down heart rate, okay? Your heart wants to beat at 100 beats per minute at rest, but it is constantly under parasympathetic influence, telling it, no, chillax, we're resting and digesting. Let's go back down to 70, okay? And then, if the sympathetic nervous system says, oh hell no, we're in an emergent situation, if we're in a fight or flight situation, an emergency, and sympathetic nervous system takes over, then heart rate goes up, force of contraction goes up in response to the situation, okay? The medulla portion of the brain, okay, and we'll talk about this later too when we talk about nervous system, but just for now, the medulla is responsible for your heart rate, okay? It has overall control of your heart rate. Okay, don't worry about amygdala, don't worry about any of that, okay? The hypothalamus is kind of the king of the castle. and he can ultimately override the medulla if needed. But the medulla is what constantly keeps heart rate moving. So you constantly have influence from the medulla, okay? Okay, so that's all I really want you to get out of that. Now, we're almost done here. I know this is kind of a big one. Okay, so coronary circulation, coronary. Right coronary artery, left coronary artery, again, vessels we're going to talk about in lab. Circumflex, interventriculars, those feed the heart as an organ. Superficial, small vessels feed the heart as an organ. That cardiac muscle tissue needs oxygen to contract, right? So the heart needs its own blood supply, all right? So that's coronary circulation. Coronary sinus, great cardiac veins, some of the other smaller veins, all part of coronary circulation. That's circulation of the heart itself as an organ in order for it to survive, okay? So what happens if somebody gets coronary artery disease, okay? So you can get two different kinds of dysfunctions. One of them, one of them is called, hold on. One of them is called arteriosclerosis. The other one is called, it's on the next slide. Athero is on the next slide, so you don't have to spell it here if you don't want to. Atherosclerosis. So they sound similar, but they're different, okay? Okay, so your arteries can either be filled with plaques, which is gooey, grody stuff that reduces the diameter of the inside of the vessels, which reduces blood flow to the heart itself as an organ, which is a big problem, okay? And that can cause heart attacks, right? Or your vessels can become hardened. And if they become hardened, they don't have the elasticity to pump and move blood to where it needs to go. So blood can stay static. So both of them are not so good, okay? So arterio is hardening of the arteries, of the arterial walls. Athero is the development of plaques on the inner walls, inner lining of the heart. So the next slide is showing you athero. Okay, so athero is going to reduce the diameter, which is not good, because you're reducing the amount of oxygen-rich blood that your heart gets in it as an organ. And if your heart can't do its job as an organ, what happens to you? Sayonara, right? Like, you can't sustain life, okay? The interesting thing about the heart, though, the amazing thing about the heart is, if any of you work at a cardiology office or have an opportunity to see angiograms or some of the heart diagrams that they do with people that have disease or have issues, the heart, if it senses, for example, maybe one of the coronaries is becoming clogged, maybe the right or the left, what it will do is it will start sprouting new branches because it realizes something is wrong here. So we're going to start creating new branches in order to promote more flow to the heart itself as an organ, which is pretty amazing, right? You have no idea this is happening, but the heart is recognizing there's a problem. I need more oxygen. I'm going to generate more branches in order to receive that oxygen. So normally, if cardiologists do a film and they see all of that branching, they know that you've had a long-standing problem over a long period of time, right? Because most people, if they get chest pain, oh, it's nothing, it's just a growing pain. They don't end up going to the cardiologist unless you're in the ER, or unless you have a healthcare professional as a spouse and says, get your ass in the ER, we got something going on, right? Unless somebody knows what's going on. Most people are like, oh, it's all right. I don't want to go to the ER. So, well, it's kind of important if you're feeling chest pain. So yeah, that's that. All right, so when they do like a bypass, if they do like a surgical bypass, you may hear of a triple bypass, quadruple bypass, quintuple bypass. That means that they've bypassed maybe 3 vessels and created new channels. And they usually strip a vessel out of your leg. Okay, when we get to blood vessels, we'll talk about your great saphenous vein. It's a very superficial vein going all the way down the medial aspect of your leg. They'll strip it so that they got this big, nice piece of blood vessel, and then they'll, cut it into however many, triple, quadruple, quintuple, however many pieces they need, and they'll create new channels. So, I mean, truly amazing what they can do in terms of heart surgery and bypass surgery. Angiograms can lead to where they're checking flow. If they're noticing, there's some impediment in some of these arteries, they may choose to do an angioplasty. And an angioplasty is where they go into the diameter inside of these blood vessels and they put a steel grate around where they're noticing a closure and they stretch it out. And they kind of like roto-rooter the plaque, okay? But you have to be careful with that because you don't want a plaque to move because it can create a clot. So you have to be careful. So angioplasties are usually where they put in stents, they call them stents, and they increase the diameter of that particular vessel in the area where they're noticing compromise. So very common. I mean, someone's probably having an angioplasty right now. Like angioplasties occur every day. So, as well as bypasses, because there are a lot of people out there with cardiovascular issues. Alrighty, I'm done.